What's going on, everyone? My name is Rosendo. Welcome back to my channel. We are back with another video, and today we're going to be taking a look at my trance mix. I know last video I mentioned this is something we would do today. Well, I guess not today, but this is something I would do next video. And I even mentioned that that there might not be a video this week, but I'm recording this 1 week after. It's hopefully going to be uploaded just 1 week after the what did I just upload? The slow breakdown. So hopefully if everything goes well, I'll be able to edit this and we'll be able to keep up a new streak going. But today, like I said, we're breaking down my trance mix. Not too much to go over here, but I definitely want to break this down a little bit just to, again, share a little bit about my thought process when I make these mixes. And again, not too much to go over. So without further ado, let's hop into Mixcloud. All right, we are back in Mixcloud taking a look at my trance mix. And if any of you saw my open format mix breakdown, it's going to be similar to that, although not really because the mixes are different. But the premise is the same. The premise is I'm going to be talking a little bit about each track, sometimes the transition, sometimes why I chose each track, yada, yada, yada. But there's a few things I want to say. And mainly this is just a time for me to give any context to these mixes, which I also think is important. But anyways, a few things I want to say. Number one, a little bit about the trance genre. Not too much I want to talk about here. I'm breaking down my trance mix. I made a trance mix. If you want a little bit more about kind of what trance means to me, you can check out my understanding track breakdown. I definitely talked a little bit about the trance genre there. I talked a little bit about, why I like it, how it grew on me, and some of the things that I want to do with the trance genre, especially what I did in that track, some of the things I want to do later. But this mix was kind of in the works while I was probably uploading this was on my to-do list for a long time, and I only recently recorded it sometime in March, I think. And I was definitely kind of working on the layout, I guess you can say, of the trance mix since like February or something. But here it is finally. Trance is also kind of definitely my type of style of music where it's very long and progressive. We'll talk about that more in a second. But the fact that trance is a very long and progressive genre, and it's really more about the movement and the flow and the emotion there. I really like the trance genre. I wanna experiment with it more. I want to get more into the progressive side of things. That way it really opens the door for myself as a trance producer, trance DJ, which I kind of consider myself a producer and DJ in all genres. So that's the main thing I want to mention. Now we can actually talk about this mix. So Trance Mix Volume 1. We're looking at my presentation of how I would DJ trance, my style, my take, my characteristics, things like that. Not as big as in my open format mix, but this really is a representation of me as a trance DJ, as me saying, hey, trance, that's under the list of the genres I know how to DJ. That's one of the things that I would like to get good at and hopefully represent myself as a trance artist, trance DJ. So that's what this does. Trance mix, you see 10 tracks, about 54-minute mix. And there's really just two things I want to say before we actually get into the mix. And these are probably, again, the breaking down the mix probably won't be all that long. But these are the two big things I wanted to say. So number one, let's talk about the trance genre. I believe in my understanding track breakdown, I mentioned that I think trance is really, really hard to mix. And that's one of the big issues I had with this, is that this was trance, I had a hard time mixing trance. And there's two reasons for this. Number one is kind of an unimportant one, and it will tie into what I'm going to mention later about this mix. But number one is, this is the unimportant one. This is the boring one. Let's get this one out of the way. Number one, I'm really big into uplifting trance. Pretty much all the tracks I have have these really, really big moments and really, really big drops. You can't just have all tracks that are uplifting and all have really big drops in them. You got to balance out your library, You got to have some high energy tracks, some low energy tracks, things like that. There's more to that in a second, but I'm big into big tracks, and that's why I like trance. I love that kind of uplifting trance, big kind of big drop type of like low energy, big drop type tracks. So that was one of the unimportant reasons. That's something that I just need to address. It's one of my problems. But that's one of the reasons this was a pretty hard mix to make. Now, number two, and this is actually where I think trance this is why I actually think trance is a hard genre to mix, at least for me. Versus the reason I just said was kind of more my problem, but for the genre itself, for trance itself, why do I think it's a hard genre to mix? If you saw my open format mix breakdown, you know that I really like to DJ kind of blending the high energy tracks and low energy tracks and making sure things kind of flow in a good direction. Long story short is this: I like to be in control of my highs and lows. I like to make sure, okay, this is a high energy track, we're going to hit it. Okay, this is a low energy track, we're going to play it. I like to really be in control of what I play when I play it, and really, really have control of the high and low energy and the mid energy points of the night / the set. Now, the hard part about trance was this. To some extent, by definition, trance has highs and lows built in them already. So it's really, really hard to kind of be in control of your highs and lows when each track will already have them built into them. Because instead of having your highs and lows through track selection, you kind of need to know which tracks you're playing because each track is going to have a high and low. And it's really hard to keep the energy high when each track will already be dipping back down and going back up. So it's really hard to be in control of where your energy is when each track already has these kind of highs and lows built into them, and you can't play around with the whole thing together. At least that's the way I see it. So again, the highs and lows are kind of out of your control because unless you're really, really smart about hot queuing tracks and you make some edits and things like that, there's going to be highs and lows already built into the track, so you don't really have control of when they appear. And the hard part about that is, well, that, and B, it also makes it really, really necessary to know these tracks really well, how they go and how they feel, because the transitions can be hard, right? Some tracks sound a very specific way for the intro. They sound a very different way for, let's say the breakdown. They sound a very different way for the drop. And then for the outro, they sound a different way as well. So sometimes when you know how a track sounds, you can think, okay, you know what, this other track would mix well with that. But if you have a track that sounds a certain way in the drop, and you have another track that you think mixes well with that, but then that track actually sounds a different way in the outro, you got to kind of know what you're getting into before you make the decision on what you're mixing. So again, two main reasons there is it was hard to control my highs and lows. That's one of the things that I really like to do. Trance made that hard. And B, you really, really need to know your tracks well, especially how they sound and how they feel, because just because two songs have pretty similar energy, they might sound good and they might sound like they mix well. If the outro and the intro of the track sound different and they don't mix well, and the whole thing kind of gets weird where the tracks, your energy and your tracks and your transitions are all over the place. I guess not the transitions, but kind of the direction is all over the place is what I meant to say. It becomes really hard. So those are the reasons why I think trance is a really hard genre to mix. I have to get a lot better, which actually is a perfect transition to my next point. My next point is this. You'll see that this is Trance Mix Volume 1. This is another third point that I probably need to get to later. So let's talk about the other thing. You know what? Let's talk about this now. You'll see this is Trance Mix Volume 1. I am actually pretty unsatisfied with how I left this mix. I'll talk more about that in a second. But the point I want to make with this is I realize I need to get better at the trance genre. And the bigger thing that I would probably want to do is include a lot more progressive and melodic house tracks, mostly progressive house tracks, but kind of like actual progressive house tracks, progressive tracks. Include more progressive tracks and kind of slower tracks in the mix to kind of really get good at, playing with those highs and lows and bridging transitions like that. You'll see I actually did that here. I'll get some more of that in a second. But I think it's going to be important to, this is something I need to get better at. Like I mentioned earlier, I have a lot of high energy tracks. I really need to expand my library. And again, I'm pretty unsatisfied with how I left this. So this is just one volume because I'll talk more about how this was made in a second. But I think this is an okay mix. I still uploaded it because, not everything's perfect. I wanted to upload a trance mix or else I wouldn't do this for a long time because I want to get really, really good at this genre. And then maybe sometime next year, I'll upload volume 2. But again, there's a lot more I need to get better at. I want to start including some more progressive, lower energy tracks in my library so I can get them in the mix. And I want to study the genre and other people's sets a little bit more, kind of see how they do it and get a style for my own sense of kind of mixing and my own sense of how I want to make my trance sets, which this is probably a good representation of it. The interesting thing is when I listen to this, I feel like this is the word I want to use is mature mix because it's slow. It progresses very slowly. It's just tracks back to back and just choosing the right tracks in the right moment. So I like this genre. I think this is a good representation. I think it's a very, very mature mix, very mature kind of listening experience. And that's one of the things I really like about this. But other than that, I do need to get better. I'll talk about what I don't like about this mix when I actually break it down. But again, this is volume 1 because there's a lot of room to improve. I really need to get good at this. I'm going to include some more lower energy tracks, some more progressive tracks, and hopefully that way I can start to kind of get better at, mixing my highs and lows, because the highs and lows are going to come through track selection here, and it's hard when they're all uplifting tracks. But let's actually get to the mix, because there's one thing I want to say about this mix specifically before we get into it, which is this. Let's talk about how I actually make my mixes, because I've made all of my mixes the same way. I talked a little bit about this in the open format mix video, but this is one of the mixes that broke the rules, and I'll tell you why in a second. But let's talk about how I make my mixes. Now, how do I actually make my mixes? Do I make them live? Do I have a track list? Do I set everything out in advance? What do I do? So I'm going to be honest with you guys, because first of all, honesty is one of my main policies. I try to follow that. And B, I'm not going to lie to you guys, right? I want to share my process with you guys. I want to make sure you guys know where this is coming from, and I want to make sure there's no confusion on what I'm doing when I make these mixes. So I plan these mixes in advance. I have a track list set. I have the transition set. But let's talk about how I actually do that. Because if you saw my open format mix video, this is kind of how the process goes. First of all, I almost always like to know what first 2 songs I'm playing. First of all, none of this applies to this mix, and I'll explain that in a second. But let's talk about how I actually make my mixes. I like to normally know what the first song I'm going to play is. I like to have that one chosen. Sometimes, and most of the time, the second song. And then I kind of freestyle it from there. But here's what ends up happening. I would treat it the same way as if I were live. I would go to the similar songs. Sometimes I already kind of have an idea of what song I want to play just by listening to it. But if I were live, I would go to the similar songs, match BPM, match key, and I would choose a song that I think I would play if I were in a live setting. So let's say I'm playing a song and I think, okay, now I don't know if I have the first 2 tracks chosen, but I don't have the third one chosen, and I'm not recording, but I'm just, sitting here in front of my computer. I think, okay, you know what song would I play next? I go to the similar tracks and I think, okay, I would probably play this song next. I drag it into the other deck, and then I see if I like it or not. If I like it, I keep it. If not, I try again. But that doesn't really happen because I don't like trying too many times, or else it does become this thing of now you're kind of preparing the mix beforehand. So what usually ends up happening is when I'm listening to a track and I think, what would I play next if I were live? And I know my songs. I'm not just guessing and seeing what sticks. I know my songs. I know what's in my library. I know how they go. I didn't know these all that much, but in general, I know my songs. I know how they go. I know what would work well and what wouldn't. So what ends up happening is I just kind of choose the song that I think I would play next. I put it in there and I think, okay, I like it. I add it to the track list. Okay, now I have the first 3 tracks, and then I repeat. I think number 4, okay, what do I do next? Let's say I'm listening to The Wave by Dan Stone. I think, you know what, I'd probably play Arcadia next. I put it in, I listen to it, I think, yeah, it's pretty good. I'll add that to the track list. And I'm already kind of getting an idea of how I would transition it. I try to transition it in here, and I think, okay, that transition works, perfect, next. And then I just keep going. I keep adding tracks. I keep making sure there's a way to transition them. And then I keep going. Every once in a while, I'll get stuck and think, okay, you know what? I have no idea what I would play next if I were live. If I were running out of time, if I were in the moment, I'd probably just echo out a transition and throw another track in there. So maybe every 3 or 4 or 5 tracks, I actually need to think, okay, you know what? Let's actually think what track works best in this scenario. But for the most part, I'm just kind of in that moment when I'm, listening to these songs, I'm dragging in tracks and more or less mimicking what I would do live, just making sure that the tracks work well together, and B, there's a transition that works there if I were to do it live. So that's how my mixes are made. And where do I go from there? I finalize that track list. I tidy up the transition. So I think, okay, when I did this on my own, when I was setting the track list, I transitioned in the outro of this part and in the breakdown of this part, and it worked. Let me just make sure they work. Okay, good. That everything works. On occasion, they won't work, and I'll stick with the track because I chose that track. That's the track I would have put live, and I'll have to figure out a transition. But that's more or less how the track lists are made, but I have everything prepped in advance, and then I just record them. So have your own opinion, say what you want. Again, it's a recreation of what I do live. I'm not doing it live, but it's what I could do live, which is why I think it's okay. I don't really think it's wrong. So what ended up happening with this mix? 2 things ended up happening. Number 1, I said I wasn't too familiar with my tracks, and it was true. I kind of rushed into this mix. I really, really wanted a trance mix. I really liked the trance genre. So I built up my library, and I just dove straight into it and made a mix. But what ended up happening is I had to think about it a lot more than I usually do. When I know my genres, when I know my tracks, for example, the open format was easy. I would drag tracks in there. I've done open format a million times. I would drag tracks in there, and the track list fell together pretty quickly, pretty close to what I would do live. But for trance, I didn't know my tracks too well. And like I said, it was hard because even if I know what the drop sounds like, but I don't know what the outro sounds like, then I made a lot of mistakes where the tracks I chose just wouldn't work together. And I ended up just kind of really, really just trying a lot of things and setting a defined track list, and more than kind of I would do live. So I don't really feel, by the way, what I should have mentioned is this is like a month ago. This is like a secondary, what you see right here on the screen is a secondary version of this trance mix. I had an original version where all this applies. I had an original version where I kind of picked the songs really carefully, and it didn't really feel like it was a representation of what I could do live. I had to think about it a lot. I had to tweak a lot of things. I had to adjust so many things, and it just didn't really feel like a good accurate representation. And I'll be honest about it, guys. Again, I'm telling you, I don't really feel bad about making that track list beforehand because it's a really accurate representation of what I could do live. That one kind of wasn't, and I wasn't satisfied with it. So I'm being honest, this is what I did before kind of wasn't. But what ended up happening, I had a trance track list, I had everything set out, and then I recorded it. And when I recorded it, I didn't feel nice. I didn't feel great about it. Don't get me wrong, I didn't feel awful, but I was just like, hey, you know what? It's not the best representation. It's also a pretty mediocre mix. It was okay because I didn't really have a lot of practice mixing trance. I had some practice with this one because I'd practiced the version 1 of this mix. So I recorded it, and then I thought, you know what? I'll just upload it, and I'm gonna make a new one later. But what ended up happening is there were some issues in the recording, that there was a lot of kind of clips and a lot of distortion there for some reason. Maybe it was something wrong with the latency with the recording or something, but it was kind of like the recording was kind of messed up. Every 10 minutes or so, you would get 30 seconds of some pretty bad clipping or some pretty bad clicking is what kind of the word is. There's some clicking, some clipping. It was just really, really bad noises. And I thought, oh man, and I was so disappointed because I spent so much time kind of developing that track list and finding the time to mix it all. And then when that happened, I thought, oh, this sucks. I have to redo it. But the issue with some of the mixes that I had is, I don't know, I always never understood. I always didn't like the fact that it took me so long to record them, because in theory, if I wanted to upload a 1 hour mix, it would only take me an hour, right? I hit record, I make a mix, and then I call it a day. But sometimes it would take me so long because I have to make a track list for so long, prep the transitions for so long. And again, sometimes it's quick. The open format mix was long just because it was a 3 hour and 40 minute mix. But some of my other ones were easy. They didn't take that long to make the track list. For example, my bass house mix was easy. I knew my genres well. Things kind of fell into place, and it was a short mix, so it didn't take all that long. But that trance mix, it took me so long because I didn't know my songs that well. I ended up making a track list that I had spent a lot of time on, and recording it was kind of a pain. And I had to make sure the transitions were perfect because I had really wanted to make them work, and all that just for the recording to be messed up. It definitely did not make me feel too good. But I didn't want to give up on it. I knew I wasn't going to post it, and I thought this is the perfect opportunity just to kind of make a new one from scratch. And that's actually exactly what I did. This is the first mix where I didn't have a track list. I had nothing prepped, and I just went for it. I didn't even have the first song chosen. So this is a very, very accurate representation of what I could do live. Actually, I did do this live. This is a live mix. Real quick side note, if a transition isn't perfect, sometimes I'll re-record it and kind of do that again. For example, if I just forgot to cut the lows or something, if I forgot to bring the lows back in, or if I just accidentally hit the wrong cue at the wrong time, I'll re-record it and I'll patch it in. But small things like that. I'm never gonna kind of like record each transition one at a time and then kind of slap everything together. Sometimes I'll quickly patch things in. So other than that, this is a fully live mix that I made, and maybe I patched in like 2 transitions because I made some minor mistake. I know in one of them, I think I forgot to put the lows back in, and I realized it halfway through, and I patched that. I think on another one, there was just, I started the track a little bit too early, and there was one really bad click where the kicks weren't aligned, and I just wanted to patch that. So things like that. But other than that, this is the first live mix I made. So here you go. Again, no cheating, if you will. I don't think what I did is cheating, but I didn't feel too good about the earlier trance mix version 1 of this because it felt really, really prepared. This was not prepared at all. Very accurate representation of what I could do live because I did do this live. This is Trance Mix Volume 1. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why this is Volume 1. Because it was very live and I don't have a lot of practice, I'm not very satisfied with this mix. I don't think this mix is all that great, especially for the trance genre. I think it's way too short. I don't really think it kind of flows all that well and tells a very good story, but I made it live. I still think it's very good. And again, I knew I wanted to make a volume 2, so I uploaded this just to kind of get the trance genre under my belt. And then maybe sometime next year, I'll kind of revamp this and release Trance Mix Volume 2. So let's actually talk about the mix now. Let's actually finally get into it after I've been recording for like 30 minutes or something. So Trance Mix Volume 1. Like I said, the first mix, I didn't have anything planned, not even the first track. What ended up happening is the first track was very, very hard to pick for this genre. And I went through so many options. But all I did was I just went through my tracks. I think, what track am I going to start with? I went through a ton of them, and I thought, okay, you know what? I like this one, Amsterdam, Cairo it is. I hit record, I started with Amsterdam, Cairo, and I went from there. So what ended up happening? Real quick, again, as I mentioned in my open format mix, I'll be listening to this on my own, just so I can kind of refresh myself on what it sounds like, but there will be no music playing in the video for copyright reasons. But you start with Amsterdam, Cairo. Now, this is actually one of the ones I would like to talk about. Why did I start with this track? Because it was impossible to pick a track to start with. This is the only one that I actually liked. So, as I mentioned in my open format mix video, The first track is very important. The second track is more important, which I talked about in a different video. But let's talk about why the first track matters so much. Because the first track, or why it was so hard here, because in my open format mix video, and actually in I guess I should talk more about the video I made about the most important track of your DJ sets. But what the first track essentially does is it defines the genre. It defines what type of music you'll be listening to, the characteristics of those songs, and things like that. And I've said before that the first track I like to have kind of a medium energy track, something not too high, something not too low, because I think it sets a good foundation for you to move on with. However, if in the trance mix, by definition, to some extent, the trance tracks have high energy drops, and you want to define your trance mix as the genre that has high energy drops, but you need to pick a first track that doesn't have high energy, it was very hard. So I ended up really liking the intro drums with this. I didn't want something to start with kind of all together with big elements, because it already gives you more high energy than you already have. You kind of have to take what the intro, what the breakdown, what the buildup have in store, and then save the drop for later. But that's one of the reasons I really like starting with Amsterdam Cairo. It kind of starts with just the drums, a little bit of atmospheric elements, and then it gets you kind of like a breakdown, and I call them verses, but like a breakdown before the vocals even come in. So it defines the genre really well, and it kind of keeps the energy at a good spot. It sounds good is basically what I'm getting at, because it's hard to put exactly into words what's going on. But it was just the only choice I really had, because other ones either started too hard, they didn't give you enough time to breathe, they were too slow, they were too high energy, things like that. Amsterdam Cairo was the only track that made sense. But again, you have the intro drums, you have this part right before the vocals come in where, you get a little bit more elements, then it drops back down to where the vocals come in, then you hit that kind of quiet point, and the drop is a good drop. It's not too high energy, but it's good high energy that it defines the genre well. Now, last thing I'll mention is the other thing you'll notice with this track is it has vocals, and only 3 of the tracks in this mix have vocals. We'll talk about that more later. Anyways, where does that leave us? It leaves us with, well, where do we go from here? If I say the second track is the most important track of your set, where do you even go from there? You take it down, right? And that's something that I don't do often. I usually like to start with medium and then take it up. Here, I kind of had to take it down, because if I took it up when you already had a high energy track, quickly becomes unsustainable, as I mentioned in both of those videos that I mentioned earlier. So after Amsterdam Cairo, we actually take it down, going into not so much of a trance track, a little bit more of a progressive track, Ignis by Marn. I really like this artist. I'm starting to realize that he makes really, really good music. And we actually take it down further with Sleepwalker by Tin Liquor. These two tracks kind of worked, they serve the same purpose, where they're not really trance tracks. Sleepwalker is definitely more of a melodic house track, but 2 things. Number 1, you'll see kind of trance artists include progressive and melodic house tracks in their sets, because it does a good job of kind of, of slowing things down and giving you a little bit of low energy. And that's one of the things I told you guys I wanted to get really, really good at. So I had to kind of do that in the beginning. And then over here, we kind of forget all about that. But in the beginning, it was a good way to slow things down, to set a foundation for what comes later. So that's why I went to Ignis. That's why I went to Sleepwalker. I actually kind of had this in my mind the entire time, and I really forced this transition. But like I said, I liked it. I really wanted to play it. So I did. That's exactly what I did. And just going from Amsterdam Cairo to Ignis just made sense. You bring it down lower with Sleepwalker, and then when you go back up, it doesn't feel all that big. We do some cool things over here, not cool, but we do some things over here that make all this work. But that's kind of what we're dealing with here, is where we take Amsterdam Cairo, already pretty high energy because it's a trance track, so we actually have to bring it down, because if you stay at the high energy, it just A, becomes stale, and B, it's unsustainable, where the second you drop in energy, which will happen because you're in trance, it just doesn't sound good. So by bringing the energy down early, when we get the higher energy tracks later, it actually sounds like we're getting high energy. Plus, with the built-in highs and lows from each track, it kind of sustains itself. That's one of the reasons I think this works. All right, and where do we go from there? The Wave by Dan Stone. Again, all of this becomes a little bit more unimportant, because I was pretty new to the track. This is all live, and it's more of the big long-term decisions that I'm making. So after that, we go into The Wave. I like this track. We go into Arcadia. I like this track. We go into Back Together. I like this track. Just kind of get those typical trance sounds. We get these big synths, big drops, and again, with the highs and lows built in, they sustain themselves. But eventually, we need to actually do something about that. We can't just have these self-sustaining tracks with all the same level of energy the entire time. We kind of need to throw in a break in there, which is exactly what we do with Sun and Moon. Sun and Moon is the perfect break, because with these kind of break tracks, I really like to let them play out and have the whole track playing and get those highs and lows. because they kind of they reset things a little bit. And Sun and Moon is a perfect track to do that, especially because it has lyrics. Just like Amsterdam Cairo did. Well, actually another Above and Beyond track, but Amsterdam Cairo also had lyrics. So it becomes this thing where we set a definition, set a tone where when your tracks have lyrics, it becomes kind of a reset, which is the other thing that actually works really well. And this is kind of a theory that I developed in my version 1 of this, because right about the halfway point, I had, what track did I have? Technicolor Boris Fawn Remix, which is, I believe, has Roxanne Emery on it, but it's another track with vocals. So it kind of defines this thing where, the way I used it in that track was a really, really nice reset. It was a long track, it had 2 verses, and it kind of really kind of gave you some room to breathe for a second. So I kind of developed this idea and this kind of, this belief, if you will, that when I do a trance mix and when I include tracks with lyrics, at least in this context, throwing in the lyrics is a really good way to reset things and kind of give you a breaking point, kind of defining a breaking point. So you get Sun and Moon, actually, I mean, a pretty like bread and butter trance track. It's almost the trance track that, everyone knows and loves. But let's talk about a little bit about what's happened at this point and why I'm not quite satisfied with this mix. These 3 tracks kind of define your intro, and then you get 3 more tracks with the Wave Arcadian back together before you get this break, which is Sun and Moon. So you're kind of DJing in 3 song blocks. You're DJing in blocks. The actual songs don't matter. But you're DJing in blocks, and things work really, really well up to this point. And you're 30 minutes in when you get Sun and Moon, 28. So it works. It works well. And I'm not too upset with all this, although Back Together comes in really quickly. So you get some really good pacing, and then this interrupts it slightly, but it kind of works because you reset it right after. But what ends up happening is, usually if I were to be a little bit more prepared, I would like to repeat kind of this energy, because you get a reset. When you get a reset, it's usually nice to go back to kind of these standard tracks because, well, you reset things. You have room to play more of these tracks and kind of let things develop even more before you get to what I would call something like a climax. And what ends up happening is right after Sun and Moon, again, I have no prep here. I know Sun and Moon's outro. I know Ilanga's intro. And that's something I wanted to do anyways, where, a quick note, I know Ilanga's intro, but I don't know the breakdown and the drop too well. I just know the intro of this song really, really well, which goes back to the point why I think trance is so hard to mix. But you get Sun and Moon, and I really liked the idea of going from Sun and Moon to something with an aggressive bass intro, because some trance tracks have that, and I really, really like that. So going from Sun and Moon to Ilanga, I actually think I worked out really well. The problem was that Ilanga is very, very orchestral and emotional, and it kind of serves really, really well. I didn't know this, as a climax track. It serves really well as a track that, gives you that climax, that gives you the high of your set. And so the transition I really liked, and it worked well. But then when I'm listening to it, I thought, oh, you know what? This is a very orchestral climax track. Because in my last mix, the track I chose for that was Memoria Interna by Andrew Rayel. And I had a few more tracks before I played that, but that was my climax track. And then I kind of hit the climax, played a few more tracks, actually also played Rebound. And then I had my outro track. But when I got to Sun and Moon and when I got to Ilanga, again, the transition works well, but it ends up climaxing a little bit too early. So that's one of the reasons I'm not quite satisfied with this track. It's one of the reasons I think this mix is way too fast. It's way too short. And I'm not exaggerating. I'm not even lying here. It's like a 52-minute mix. I'm not saying it's too short because it's not 60 minutes and 60 minutes is the standard. I think it's too short just because the pacing isn't there. You got really good pacing here. You got decent pacing here. You reset it with Sun and Moon, but a reset is usually your opportunity to build things back up. Take my open format mix, for instance, where you get Monaco by Bad Bunny. Very good reset for you to build things back up in the same way you build them up in the intro. You get away with being able to do the exact same thing, albeit a little bit faster, because you reset the energy and you reset the night with kind of a reset track. Here's my reset track, but we end up going to a really good transition to Ilanga, but Ilanga is really orchestral, really emotional, and it ends up being the climax track, so I think it's just a little bit too soon. But I already knew I was going to do a volume 2, so I rolled with it. Where do we go from Ilanga? We go to Rebound, a track that I honestly is becoming one of my favorite tracks, just period. And it's a track that I definitely had in my first version. I knew I wanted it to be my second to last track. So going from Ilanga, going from my climax track to Rebound, where you get that emotion, you get that kind of progression, you get the development and the sound of Rebound. That's kind of where we were going. That's where it was going to be all along. Climax track into Rebound, second to last track. And then you actually get kind of your outro track, what I call the closure track of the night. And this is strictly recency bias, by the way, because I believe in my other mix, I was closing out with Paul Van Dyk's Music Rescues Me. And that was after Rebound, but it was a really forced transition. But here, on the day I recorded this mix, I was in my car and I was just listening. I knew I was just going to think, today's the day I'm going to record it. And I think I need to kind of familiarize myself with my trance tracks. And when this played, I was listening to it and I thought, hey, it was actually really nice. So after Rebound, I already had this track in my head and I just decided to end with it. I knew it would make a good ending track, but I didn't know it would be the one I'd used. So after Rebound, I decided to end it with Elise Factor B. Now this does two things. Number one, so my take on these mixes is you can end them in an artistic way, and Rebound would have been the perfect way to end it artistically. There are a lot of mixes that kind of do that, but I like to have this track at the end that just gives you some closure, gives you a little bit more emotion, and maybe even has a little bit more, it's a little bit more complete on its own, that it gives you a little bit more closure and it lets you feel like the mix is actually ending. Instead of ending on kind of this beautiful kind of artistic end, which could have been Rebound, you just throw in one more track to kind of bring you back down to earth and to ground you for the end of the mix. So that's the purpose of Elise Factor B, is it's emotional, and what ends up happening as well is not only does the track kind of work really well on its own, but we come back to this thing where the first track of the mix had lyrics. Your reset track has lyrics. And you end it with the track that has lyrics. So you kind of, by defining these kind of features of your mix, makes it really nice to end with a track with lyrics, because it kind of, again, the lyrics make it self-sustaining, so it gives you that closure, and it already allows you to prepare and know that this is the end, this is the last track we're going to get, and allows you to really enjoy that ending. So that's one of the nice things that really ended up happening here. And I'm not saying that I'm going to do this every time. I'm not saying that, you should use tracks with lyrics for that purpose, but I do think they have their edge for that reason. They're self-sustaining. They can serve that purpose. And in this track, in this set, it ended up working really well that way, where you start with Amsterdam Cairo. When it's time to reset it, you get Sun and Moon. And then Elise Factor B remix is the good kind of end to the mix. So again, I'm not just making this up. I'm rambling a lot on these things, but these are the kind of things this is the process that goes through my head when I'm making these sets, on trying to give things direction, trying to give things structure, making sure things are like digestible, making sure things kind of make sure they have their place. There's intention behind these things versus just playing tracks back to back, because even though that's what I did here, things they have their intention, things serve their purpose, and there's some structure to these sets. But again, that's my trance mix. I do think it's way too fast. We're looking at a 54-minute mix, basically 54-minute mix, and I just think it's way too fast. That's my biggest gripe with this, is usually after a reset track, you're able to repeat some standard stuff, and then you get to the climax. And I didn't do that here because this was live. I went from Sun and Moon to Yolanga. I liked the transition, but I wasn't too familiar with the fact that this is a more orchestral climactic track. So I had to roll with it, and that's where we ended with Trance Mix Volume 1. So again, Volume 2 will happen at some point. I want to include a little bit more progressive. I want to make sure I get better at transitioning. I want to make sure I know my tracks better and give things more structure. But at least now I have trance under my belt. I think it's a really, really good genre that I can work with if I'm ever opening for someone, especially with these more progressive tracks. So you can keep things lower energy for the headliner. And yeah, there you go. I really like trance. All right, so that is about all I have for you. I talked way more about this than I thought I would, and than I thought I could have. But I should have known. Anyways, there you are. Thank you guys so much for watching. Let me know if you have any questions. Let me know what you thought about the mix, if you listened to it, if you didn't, if you think it's too fast, if you think it's too short. Let me know what you think about its characteristics. Again, I described it as a very mature mix. I think that it's slow, it progresses well. Let me know if you agree or disagree. Let me know if you have any trance mixes that you really like, if you've made any on your own, what characteristics you like, what strategies or intention you employ in your mixes, and all that stuff. Don't forget, you can stream this mix on Mixcloud. I have Spotify where I upload all my tracks. And if you're in the market for an instrumental or beat, if you're a content creator and you would like to get an instrumental or beat for one of your videos, you can check out my Airbit store to get one of your own. And finally, last announcement here in the time of announcements is, what do I have coming next? Next up, we have my drum and bass release for May 2nd. It is a remix, so not going to be out on streaming services. Hopefully, will be out on SoundCloud if I have no issues. We get a remix available for free download. That's going to be kicking off a new series. Blondie, One Way or Another, Rosendo Drum and Bass Remix. Most of you probably know that track. And yeah, this is going to be kicking off a yearly series where around this time of year, I'm going to be, hopefully this is my plan at least, around this time of year, I'm going to be releasing a remix of a popular track in drum and bass format for drum and bass DJs to add to their playlist. Yearly series. I already know what 2 tracks I'm playing next. or sorry, 2 tracks I'm remixing next. But this year's track is One Way or Another by Blondie. You got a drum and bass remix for free download available for all you drum and bass producers. Spread the word, download it, share it. That's going to be out first Friday of May. That's going to end up being May 2nd. So keep an eye out for May 2nd for my drum and bass remix of Blondie, One Way or Another. But other than that, that is all I have for you. Thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all next time.